Dome. My name is Emily Brewer and I will be your host for today's program. Under the Dome is Town Meeting TV's coverage of the Vermont legislative session. And in this series, we speak with legislators and advocates about the bills moving through the legislature this year and also what that might mean for you and your neighbors. So today we have two legislators from South Burlington with us today, Representative Martin Lalonde and Senator Thomas Chittenden. Thank you both for joining us today in the studio.
Thank you.
And so we'll start out, I'll start with you, Tom. Both of you serve on a few different committees and panels, but Thomas in particular, you serve on two committees, a joint committee on oversight, the New England Board of Higher Ed, several more, another Progress Council, and you used to be a city councilor for the town of, or the city of South Burlington. And my main question is here, how do you balance all of those jobs and still do your work well?
So the last part, I don't know if I do accomplish that. Some would argue different ways. I'd say I've always had a lifetime of service. In high school, I was in the Key Club. In college, I was a resident assistant. After college, I remember working on political campaigns like Howard Dean's presidency. I was a volunteer firefighter back in Williston. I've just always found time to give back to my community. I found city council to be an extension of that. That being the case, I am no longer on the South Burlington City Council. I just finished up my term this past March, and it was partly because I feel like I was spreading myself too thin. As for the committees you just listed, I'll say not all of them are active. For example, the Vermont State Infrastructure Bank Board has only met twice since I've been appointed to it, so it's a rather what I call somnolent committee, so it doesn't have a large time commitment, but we do have the State Senate does appoint to it. VEPSI I was just appointed to, and I took that on knowing that the South Burlington City Council was wrapping up, and I have a lot of experience with TIFs, which the tax increment finance districts, which VEPSI oversees. So I saw some synergies and overlapping with that. But to answer your question, I like to be busy. That's what I do. I also have a full-time job and 3 kids in public school. So I find that it's better to not have enough hours in the day, and I always like to say if you want to get something done, give it to somebody who's busy. As to whether or not I do all of these roles well, that's arguable, but I do see value in the intersection of many of these topics that cross, that intersect the jurisdictions of each of the topic areas.
Great, and same for you, Martin. You know, you're on a lot of committees as well, but in particular, you're serving as the chair of the Judiciary Committee in the House. Can you share what that committee's been up to this session and also what it means to be the chair of a committee?
Sure, I'd love to do that. But first, I want to compliment the somnolent. I'm going to use that for describing some of the other committees that I'm on as well, the ones that don't meet very often. So this is my 5th term in the legislature. And the first 8 years I was on the Judiciary Committee. My 3rd term I was a ranking member of the Judiciary Committee. And last term I was an assistant majority leader, as well as staying on the Judiciary Committee. So I feel I was ready to move into this new position, new challenges, being a chair of a committee. The biggest challenge is just agenda setting, which is really where the influence comes in for being a chair as well, because you can largely set the agenda and which bills you're going to take up. Of course, there are priority bills of the caucus and of the legislature that I have to take up, but otherwise there's a lot of leeway, a lot of flexibility as far as what I'm able to take up. So I'm blessed with an exceptional committee. It's really a good committee. We had 7 returning members on the committee, although one of the members had to retire or resign because of too many other things going on in this committee's member's life, work, family. Sometimes it's really hard to do if you have really young kids. Any event, but we filled that seat with another individual, so we have 4 new legislators on the committee, one who came over from corrections and institutions, but they just are just top notch. It makes the committee much easier to work with. They take on work, they take on responsibility. They're super smart. We have a fun time. It's a really good atmosphere in the committee as well. We're able to keep it light, which is important often because we do deal with some pretty tough issues: domestic violence, sexual violence. There's the intersection of the criminal justice system with the mental health system. So we have some pretty heavy topics, so it's good to have be able to keep it light with the individuals we have. So I'm blessed to have the committee that I have, and we, I think, have done some really good work this year as well.
Well, I will say that when we took a trip to the State House last week, we spoke with a representative that's on the Judiciary Committee, and she spoke very highly of you and your leadership.
That's very
so,
kind.
so it's felt throughout the committee. So, before we move on to the next question, I do want to give folks a chance. I forgot to mention this in the intro. We are accepting calls, so if you have a question for either Martin or Tom, please call in at 802-862-3966. We'll prioritize your questions, but in the meantime, we'll keep moving down my list. So this session, there's been some big investments that the Democrats have put on the table for Vermont families, such as investments in childcare, paid family and medical leave, affordable housing, and the list goes on. And so starting with Tom, can you speak about the impact that those investments would have on your constituents in South Burlington if passed, both in services and resources they offer, but also in the tax impact that they'll have?
Certainly. I might focus on childcare since I spent some time on that in Senate Finance, and I have a pretty good idea of some of the struggles in Vermont. The pandemic really shone a light on how difficult and expensive it is to find care to cover, to take care of children in the great state of Vermont. What this bill that is moving forward will do is will increase the subsidies available to different income levels, a larger income band, which will do two things. One will allow for or make it more affordable to get child care, but also funnel more money into the child care system so as to be able to pay child care providers enough to attract them to want to serve in that profession. Because it's not just a matter of the cost of child care, it's about the availability. The wait lists are years in advance. I remember how difficult it was for us to find a child care provider. We had a great experience with a small little provider, but we had to ask permission when we wanted to have our second and third child, just to make sure she had room for us. So I think what we're doing on child care is going to be very important. And in Senate Finance, we had businesses testify that this is a workforce development issue. Enabling people to re-enter the workforce and to focus on jobs is what child care can do. And so this is part of the solution that businesses are definitely advocating and supporting. The Senate proposed a financing mechanism that would translate to, I believe, 0.42% payroll tax paid for by 75% of that from the employer with 25% of it from the employee. I believe the House has revised that and used an income tax. So there's a slight increase in the income tax and then a full half a percentage point without the employer contributions. I don't know all the details. It just came out of their committee last week, and so I'm looking forward to seeing how that compares with what we passed. That will have an impact on employees. If you work in the state of Vermont and these pass, you will see a reduction if it is on to the employee. Even if it does an employer tax, that does translate into their availability to offer benefits as well as raises and increases. The other places that I could talk more on, but I don't know how much time we have on each of these things, is on housing, because that too, I always say all roads lead to housing. To have more people to take care for our children, to serve in all the industries that we need, to have more people in Vermont, and also make housing more affordable, we need more housing across the income spectrum, both affordable housing and housing that is affordable. And so I'm happy, I'm excited about the home bill that is working its way through the House right now. I think it's going to do a lot of great things to address that root issue that is causing a lot of problems in multiple sectors within our economy.
Yeah. So I agree with everything Tom says. That's the easy way out, but I'll expand a little bit. Last summer and fall, leading up to the election, even though I didn't have an opponent, I did knock on doors and went out and talked to a lot of constituents, which is actually one of the best parts of the jobs, is getting to do that, knocking on neighbors' doors and talking to them. And the two or three main issues, there were a couple others, but the top five issue was certainly child care, having more affordable, more available child care and quality care. Housing was a second, and also paid family leave. Those three really go together as far as a lot of my constituents and what I think as well. So the investments we're making there are, I think, really critical for my district, and I've had a lot of support for, and with an understanding that it is going to cost, obviously. But I think majority of the people I've talked to really are in support of those particular issues. So, although on the housing issue, there's been certainly some controversy with that particular bill in South Burlington. There are some concerns. We've made sure that the committees that are taking those up have heard from our city council and from our city planner that had time to present various ideas of how to improve that bill. But I think it's a very important bill that we do get through, and it looks like we will. So.
Well, and that leads right into my next question, which kind of explores the topic of housing in South Burlington a little further. So could you, either of you or both, talk a little bit more about any of the affordable housing money? Do you foresee any of this landing in particular South Burlington housing development projects? And further, do you think that Act 250 needs to be reformed to address the housing crisis?
I'll let you go first.
Great. So the second part to your question, I'd probably speak more to yes. So Act 250 has done great things for the state of Vermont. It was passed 50 years ago in a different time, in a different era when we had different priorities and different issues putting pressure on things. I am not advocating to repeal Act 250. Act 250 is statewide zoning when there is no zoning, and it does a lot of great things to make sure that people are heard and that we have good planning put in place. That being the case, nothing is written in stone. Nothing is infallible, and Act 250 could be tweaked. It could be adjusted for the times, could be modernized. When we look at the housing crisis we're in today, I'm a strong proponent for making tweaks to Act 250 in tandem with the changes in the home bill that also address local control issues and local permitting. The government, the state of Vermont, can't build all the houses. It just doesn't work that way. That's not what we do. We're overseeing policy. What we can do is we can look at the regulatory frameworks at both the local level and the state level to enable and drive policy that we want to see happen and behavior in the marketplace. And that's where Act 250 is absolutely part of the conversation. I'm happy and glad for what came out of the Senate regarding Act 250 reform. For anybody that was following the press closely, I wanted to see more, and I did advocate for that. I'm still supportive of the home bill as presented, but there was some additional Act 250 changes that were proposed by the Senate Economic Development Committee that were taken out by the Senate Natural Resources Committee, and I understand the House is is at least looking at it. The Rural Caucus is supporting that same change I recommended. Can elaborate? There is this, again, I don't know if you want to give me a clock or something, I could just babble on for hours, but there is this behavior modifier in Act 250 that's been in place for a long time, where if you own land, I own 4 acres in South Burlington. I am not planning to develop. My wife does not want houses behind our house. But if I wanted to, I, as an individual landowner, could put up to 9 additional units on my land within 5 years, within 5 miles of that land, without triggering Act 250. So as soon as I'd want to put a 10th unit, not that I want to put any units on my land, I don't, but if I wanted to put 10 units on my land, all of a sudden my paperwork would go from this at the local level to this at the statewide level. And the costs associated to that paperwork and the time and uncertainty is bewildering. And it scares off from people from putting that 10th unit onto their properties. And so what I think Martin, Representative Lalonde would see in South Burlington and attest to, I know it's all around my neighborhood, there are these 9-unit developments on land that could easily support Virgin's clay, protecting all the natural resources that could take 14 units, or they could take 20 units, but they're not doing that many units on those smaller parcels because they're avoiding the paperwork. That is an arbitrary, I asked all the people that have been around for a long time, why 10 units? Why this 9 units? It's because the number sounded good 50 years ago. And so as I would say, what I argue for and still think would be a great small change that would address the crisis that we're in today is let's tweak that. My amendment on the floor was to increase that to 25 units for 3 years, and 3 years is important because of interim zoning that would protect any community that didn't feel prepared for it. And I also proposed not statewide, but only in communities with planning and zoning. But that was 4 minutes, so maybe I should stop there.
I'll let Martin, if there's anything you'd like to add.
Well, yeah, I'd like to add that I definitely respect the committee process, and we have 2 committees in the House that are looking at this particular bill. I think it's important to balance what Act 250 has done for the state over the last decades, and that is really keeping the state, the Green Mountain State, and keeping reducing development, but we do recognize that there is a need for more housing. And I am in support of, if you're going to do housing, it should be denser where in the appropriate spots. But that does have to be balanced against the other needs for a community that you want to have in a community. You want to have some open space. You want to have wildlife corridors, et cetera. So there's a balance that goes on there. And the big issue is how much the state should dictate that versus local zoning. My inclination is that it should be more the local zoning, but I'm really going to let the committee do its work to figure that out. I think South Burlington definitely, and Tom probably knows the figures better than I do, have definitely been doing our part regarding housing over the last 10 years. I think we've built hundreds of units in South Burlington, and that should be respected as well. We're certainly doing our part to help with respect to housing. And there's more that should be done. I absolutely agree with that. As for Act 250, there was a bill that I supported last year that was passed. It really was more in the governance of Act 250 that was vetoed and not overridden. That seems to be a dead letter at this point, and they're looking at different tweaks for Act 250 this year, with the emphasis being on dense development in the appropriate locations. And I agree with that concept, definitely.
Well, the topic of housing, at least in my mind, does go hand in hand with education. And in South Burlington in particular, schools, well, in all over Chittenden County, schools are overflowing. And it seems like some big investments are needed in order to accommodate the growing student population. I'll let either of you speak to this first, but what can the legislature do about that?
Well, one thing is we should watch out what we're doing as far as housing. If we're making it so that communities are going to have to build more housing, there has to be respect for the results of that. Can be more students going to our already overcrowded schools. And so I've been working, at least for the last 8 years, I've been working towards having the state support school construction. They did this for a long time. They would cover 30% of the cost of school construction. That there's been a moratorium since the late 2000s. I can't remember exactly when, but we need assistance from the state to deal with our crowded schools, but also with schools across the state that are really in need of renovation and maintenance backlogs need to be addressed. So it seems like we're moving a little bit towards that. I think that the treasurer that we have now is more open to bonding for assistance in school construction, but we have probably $2.5 to $3 billion of needs in school construction, and I think that hasn't been receiving enough attention. We can build houses and bring families here, but if we don't have a place to put their kids, it's going to be tough to continue to attract families to the state. So.
Absolutely.
I'd offer one thing, and it's more of a systemic perspective, and I will have a counterpoint. This is something that when I first got involved in city council politics back in 2014, I met with somebody that I still hold in very high regard, and I need to reach out to him, is Jim Condos. He was a South Burlington city councilor for many years, and a state senator, and then secretary of state. And I just wanted to get his perspective on a lot of topics. And on education in the state, I was also talking to his daughter the other day, and she remembers him saying this very thing, and I'd be curious how much this overlays with, or is validated with your perspective. But when Act 60 was passed in the 90s because of the Brigham decision, pooling all of the education dollars and resources, that has changed the incentive structure for when it comes to funding our schools. Prior to the Brigham decision, when a community wanted a new high school, they would work with their city, and the city would enable zoning for commercial enterprises so that, for example, in South Burlington, they zoned for the University Mall, for the tech park over there, by the airport as well, to have commercial enterprises to contribute to a tax base that would then help offset or subsidize the costs of the school relative to the residential owners or taxpayers, property taxpayers. So there was an incentive for growth, commercial growth. But when Act 60 passed, now all the money gets sent to the state, and then it gets redistributed based on how many kids there are, so that incentive to allow for more growth was dissipated. And now people see only the negatives, besides the municipal burden is actually still spread as grand lists are grown. But a reason why I bring that up now is I want people to start to see that the way that we can also grow the denominator for how much our tax burden is to pay for these schools is to look for ways to bring the right economic activity to the state of Vermont. For example, Beta. Beta is doing some amazing things in South Burlington. It is putting $300 million into a new plant, and now they're expanding up to St. Albans and also to Caledonia County. Those are green tech jobs that are bringing more opportunity, more investment, more activity that will lighten the tax load for the rest of us going forward. My concern that since the 90s, for the last 20, 30 years now almost, we're just not growing the grand list for commercial activities to keep up with and also incentivize the investments in our schools that since 2007 there's been a moratorium on bonding. It's part of the systemic issue.
Right.
It's not the only solution, but it's just important for us to see that we want to grow the denominator with the numerator in order to keep the tax burden manageable.
Right, right. Yeah, no, I agree with that as well. So, I know you have other questions, but I was hoping to also cover a couple of things that our Judiciary Committee has done,
I would
if that's
love that.
okay?
Go right
If
ahead.
that's- Yeah, just
Please do.
because I think we've done some really good work this year. Tomorrow, we'll be passing out for concurring with the Senate the proposal of amendment to a bill called H-89, which is a SHIELD bill. It's to provide protections for individuals who come to the state of Vermont to get legally protected health care in Vermont, gender-affirming care, reproductive health care. It also will protect providers of those legally protected health care activities, which is a very critical bill given what's going on around the country. I mean, states are looking to hold people that are not in their state criminally or civilly liable for providing gender-affirming care or reproductive health care. And we want to protect our providers here, even if they're reaching out to help somebody in a state that bans those procedures. A companion Senate bill is back in the Senate with some amendments from the House, which I think we'll be passing out very soon as well, which protects a provider's license if they have any problem with their license in another state because they provided health care that we protect here in Vermont, that they won't have consequences in Vermont. Same with insurance. So that's been a really important bill. Another important bill that we've passed out that is in the Senate and should be coming back probably with some changes is a suicide prevention firearms bill that would establish a 3-day waiting period, would implement a secure storage law, and would improve our red flag law, where somebody can get an extreme risk protection order to remove firearms from somebody who's a danger to themselves or others. So those are two really big bills that we've worked on, but we've worked on a number of initiatives related to domestic violence and being able to protect survivors in those situations, allowing certain domestic violence disputes to go to community justice centers is one, to address abusive litigation where somebody who is an abuser uses our courts to continue to abuse a victim. So we've addressed those issues as well. So it's been quite a bit of things that we've been working on. One last thing I'll mention is we've really been working, and this is a biennium project of, so it's not going to be done this session, is putting more resources and oversight and codification of restorative justice practices, where individuals can be kept out of the criminal justice system entirely and go through a different path if they've done something wrong. So these are some of the important things that we've been working on in Judiciary Committee. So.
Thank you, Martin. And those all are very important things that need to be worked on. And before we wrap up here, Tom, is there anything that you'd like to add, just in addition as what you're working on in your committee?
Sure, but I also want to just say I have long admired Representative Lalonde. He's served longer than I have. His advocacy and energy on the very important topic of gun control, and I'm very excited about the suicide prevention bill that is making its way through the Senate now for the 72-hour waiting period as well as safe storage. So great work. Thank you for all you've done and all you continue to do. I look forward to supporting that bill. I serve on Senate Transportation as well as Senate Finance. One thing that I think a lot of the viewing public might be interested in is we're starting to look at ways to have electric vehicles pay their fair share for our roadways. So every time you fill up at the gas pump, you're paying a gas tax, which pays to plow, pave, and paint our roads. So those roads still need to be plowed, paved, and painted, but electric vehicles aren't paying the gas tax. And so what you will see, we are going to, in the transportation bill, be seeking federal money to actually flesh out how it would look to charge electric vehicles through a mileage-based user fee for Vermonters, that when they inspect their car, it will check how many miles you had the last time and how many miles when you inspect it this time. And the difference, there'd be a small adjustment, somewhat comparable to how much you'd pay in the gas tax. That would only apply to entirely electric vehicles, so entirely plug-in vehicles, they would pay it that way. Hybrid vehicles, there'd be a proposed to look into how this would translate to an increased car registration fee. So if you currently pay $100 a year, it might be $175. And then also, since that would only get Vermonters, but out-of-staters use our roads too. When you look at how EV behavior is, I don't know if you have an EV yet, but a lot of out-of-staters are expected to need, out-of-towners and out-of-staters are going to use those level 3 direct chargers, the fast chargers, as you see at like Healthy Living or so on. So we're included in that study is to look to have a charge on the pump of the electric charge pump. So that's what we're going to expect back in the next year or two. Nothing's going into effect right away. This is to understand the contours of that. It's something that we're looking at maybe beginning in 2025 when market saturation or adoption rate of EVs reaches a certain threshold, but it's on the 5 to 10 year horizon that we want EVs to start contributing to pay for our roadways.
Great, thank you. And before we finish up here, one last question. We'll start with Martin. How can your constituents get involved in the legislative process at this point, as well as a follow-up to that, how can they reach you and get in contact with you?
Sure. So being a citizen legislator, when I have constituents reach out to me about issues, that certainly helps me focus on what issues I should look at. But I often ask them to help out a little bit. If they have ideas, I ask them to scope out a little bit what the solution to the problems are, and very much like working with constituents to figure out how to address certain issues that we have before us. So on a monthly basis, I have a column in the other paper. I always include my email address, which is mlalone@state.leg.vt.us. And I have my phone number on there as well, which is 802-863-3086. Usually people contact me by phone. And I'll probably once again start having a weekly coffee at the Panera, which I've done, but I've not really fully gotten back to that since the pandemic, but we'll be doing that again soon.
That's fantastic, thank you. And same question to you, Tom.
Sure. Well, we do legislative forums, so I should be at a Shelburne one right now, but I prioritize this.
Appreciate that.
I do hop around all the communities in my district, and tonight, for example, South Burlington is having one from 6 to 7 p.m., so those are great to go to. Definitely email, phone calls. You can also come to the State House. If constituents email me, I do my darndest to respond back. Not necessarily the same day, and sometimes when you ask me questions about less topical issues, it takes me some time to research, so I try to catch up on the weekends. But you can reach me at thomaschittenden.com, and the ledge email, it's always hard and I bumble it, so thomaschittenden@gmail.com. You should be able to find me, or thomaschittenden.com is a great way to contact me.
Great. Well, thank you both to Martin and Thomas for joining us in the studio today. That wraps up our episode of Under the Dome with South Burlington, a partial part of the South Burlington delegation. So, thank you all for tuning in and watching. Under the Dome will be continuing throughout the end of the legislative session, connecting you with your representatives in Montpelier. You can find this program and others at our website, www.ch17.tv, or on our Town Meeting TV YouTube channel. Thanks for watching and sharing Under the Dome from Town Meeting TV. Have a great day.